Hello everyone. Today we are focusing on Chapter 27, Writing a Good Conclusion section. In this chapter, we are going to see how to write a conclusion or discussion section for your qualitative study. The conclusion section is the final passage in a qualitative report. Sometimes it is called the discussion. To give you a clear overview, the content is divided into 5 parts. 1. Why the skill is important. 2. How do you conclude a qualitative study? 3. Perspectives on elements of a conclusion section. 4. 2 approaches to concluding a qualitative study. 5. Summary. 1. Why the skill is important. This skill is important because of the following reasons. Firstly, review of research questions. It is important for reviewing how your research questions were answered with the findings. Secondly, focus on significant aspects. The conclusion focuses the reader's attention on the most important aspects of your study, and it shares the unique contribution of your study. Thirdly, foundation for future work. As the end point of a project, it can also serve as a jumping-off point for additional research or practice for other researchers or practitioners. Moreover, consideration on further research. It can raise important questions for further research and outline the limitations encountered, which should be considered by future researchers. Finally, accepted practice in research reporting. Writing a conclusion section to a research study is an accepted part of the process of reporting research, and it needs to be written so that it covers important elements in concluding a study. 2. How do you conclude a qualitative study? The author explores how to conclude a qualitative study and offers various strategies and styles. Firstly, the author highlights the importance of concluding research. You must conclude. What choices do you have? This question posed by Bogdan and Backlund sparked years of thinking for John. This thinking process centered on a specific case. A 43-year-old graduate student who entered a classroom with a Korean War-era semi-automatic rifle, which jammed, leading to his flight from the scene. Secondly, he suggests different ways of concluding. 1. Creswell turned the case through 5 qualitative research methods in his book, each method leading to a different research conclusion. Walcott suggested 2 endings. The first he called the canoe into the sunset approach. 2. This conclusion section of your research should include a summary of findings, a comparison with the literature, a personal interpretation of the findings, limitations, and future research. It also includes comments on the significance of the study. Furthermore, he discusses the transition from predictability to uncertainty. Creswell discusses how to make the familiar seem strange, and how disturbing events can reveal predictable cultural patterns through ordinary role behavior in response to unexpected events. In the second type of ending, Walcott suggests Creswell move towards uncertainty, writing with a more interpretive quality and contemplating the complexity of the situation. Lastly, he advocates for interpretive writing and reflection on complexity. Creswell indicates that if his analysis was interpretive, he might test his conclusions and include participants' cautions and expectations to suggest that the situation is more complex than he has presented. John learned that there are multiple ways to end a study, yet he found little mention in the broader literature of how to write a conclusion section and what it should contain. 3. Perspectives on elements of a conclusion section. The author have found a approach to write about concluding a qualitative study. Some of the perspectives are listed as follows: a summary of the findings, a discussion about the implications of the study, a call for further research or further actions, commentary on the personal stance of the author, limitations of the study, the conclusions that result from using a specific qualitative design, information that appropriately fits the type of research tale being told, the unique contribution of the study. Now let's see the details of each perspective. 1. A summary of the findings. The conclusion section needs to move beyond the detail of the codes and themes in the findings and summarize the major elements found in the study. As Mayin stated, in the conclusion, the researcher should summarize the findings clearly. This summary might provide specific answers to the research questions, and you could restate the research questions and then show how the participants answer the questions. Alternatively, you can summarize the major themes of the study and focus on the general evidence of the themes. We would not simply repeat the themes, but provide an overview of each theme in the conclusion section. 2. Implications of the study. Sometimes this is referred to as the interpretation of the findings. It often takes the form of relating the summary or themes to the broader literature. This section is a point where the citations and the references come back into a qualitative study. To write this section requires asking yourself how your themes are consistent with those derived by other authors, and how they are inconsistent. Moreover, once this assessment is made, you can then reflect on why a consistency or an inconsistency exists. This approach to grounding the findings in the literature parallels what we often find in quantitative research studies. 3. Call for further research. It is standard practice to make suggestions for future research that will build on the current findings in the conclusion section. This practice cannot be underestimated. When new scholars look for topics to study, they often reflect on the further research implications of studies. In this passage, we would enumerate several potential directions for future studies that directly build on the themes we have reported in our findings section. We are specific about these recommendations and may cite other authors who have also talked about the need for further study. Sometimes this further study is to develop new practices, to add to the literature, or simply to repeat a study within a new context. Sometimes this further study aims to improve on the research practices used in the present study. 4. Commentary on personal views. The personal interpretation that a qualitative researcher forms during a study is also useful information for a conclusion section. This aspect sets qualitative research apart from quantitative research. Perhaps a section of your study already provides a perspective on reflexivity, as mentioned in Chapter 26. Interpretation cannot be separated from your personal values, beliefs, and ethics, and it relates to your standpoint as postmodern writers would say. Thus, it is acceptable in qualitative research to convey the meaning you would draw from your themes and your reflections on the overall findings in a qualitative project. 5. Limitations. Although Marshall and Rosman talked about identifying limitations in the introduction to a quality proposal, it is standard procedure to identify limitations also at the conclusion of a study. Here a balance is required between acknowledging potential limitations in a study and creating a list that might be seen as too overwhelming and indicative of a weak study. Furthermore, the limitations can be related to many aspects of study, such as elements of the methods, the theoretical orientation used in the project, the lack of substantial evidence in the themes, or the constant need to change the questions to best fit an understanding of the central phenomenon. What is not helpful is to construct limitations that relate to quantitative research, such as limits to generalizability or the lack of a large sample. Researchers should remember that a qualitative study has different purposes and strengths. 6. Conclusions within a specific design. As will be discussed in Chapter 30, the endpoints in conclusion sections for qualitative studies that are framed within specific designs differ. In a narrative project, the conclusion might include a discussion that ties together a personal story. In a phenomenological study, a discussion paragraph can advance how the participants experienced the phenomenon and the context in which they discuss it. In a grounded theory project, it might include a diagram of a theoretical model generated during the project. And in an ethnography, it might include a description as to how the culture sharing group works. In a case study, it might include a summary of a description of the case and the themes that emerged. 7. Type of research tale. The conclusion of a qualitative research project is influenced by the type of narrative chosen, known as the research tale, which is part of the study's larger framework. Van Manen identified three main ethnographic genres: realistic, confessional, and impressionist tales. A realistic tale presents participant perspectives with the author's voice minimized, focusing on daily life details. A confessional tale is introspective, emphasizing the researcher's personal experiences and thoughts. A impressionist tale involves the reader in a dramatic narrative, which rich in detail and leading to a climactic resolution. The chosen narrative style dictates how the study's conclusions are shaped and presented, whether they prioritize participant views, the researcher's insights, or the unfolding of a dramatic event. 8. And with the unique contribution of the study. We always suggest that the final sentence in the conclusion address the unique contribution of the study. Hopefully, in this way, you will reinforce what readers have already learned. If they have not learned it, you have not made it explicit and told the readers about the uniqueness of your project. This ends the study on a positive note. Just as the first sentence in a study is important, the final sentence is also significant. 4. Two approaches to concluding a qualitative study. The two approaches are scientific approach and literary approach. 1. A scientific approach. This first article illustrates the inconclusion of many of the elements that could go into a conclusion section of a qualitative study. This article sought to understand the resettlement experiences of women who were internally displaced by northern Uganda's 21st-year armed conflict. In this section, the author highlights the final section of this study. 1. Research question restated. 2. Summary of the key findings. 3. Literature comparison. 4. Further explanation. 5. Study limitations. 6. Implications for practice with recommendations. 7. Further research. Now let's see how the author wrote the conclusion. 1. The conclusion and recommendations begins with restating the research question. This qualitative study explored change in women's social, economic, and cultural roles and responsibilities resulting from the experiences of more than 20 years of armed conflict and internal displacement. 2. The author summarizes the key findings. While the social, economic, and cultural effects on women's roles and responsibilities were described separately, the strong connection among these domains is unavoidable. The most commonly reported changes in this study were women's greater share of the responsibility for cultivating food and providing income for their households, and men's decreased involvement in family responsibilities. Most often reported explanations for men's decreased involvement were men's increased use of alcohol and decreased commitment to marriage in culturally recognized ways. 3. The author relates key findings to the literature. The changes in marriage practices increased women's exposure to land disputes and placed women in conflict with extended family members or newcomers to the area, especially when the traditional leaders' credibility to make decisions was weakened post-conflict. 4. The author adds to this an explanation. The study also identified ways in which women responded to the economic challenges of providing sufficient food and income to care for their families by working together in groups to supplement their individual efforts. 5. Study limitations are then discussed briefly. A limitation of the study included the use of convenience samples from 4 villages, which may not be representative of the women in these 2 districts. The use of an interpreter may have stilted the conversational nature of the interviews, thereby constricting the fullness of the women's responses. The purpose of using a qualitative method in this study was to gain understanding of the lived experiences of women. However, these findings may not be generalizable beyond this context. 6. Implications for practice with recommendations. It is recommended that program developers working with populations that have been displaced by armed conflict understand the effect of the conflict and displacement on women, families, and communities from their perspectives. The richness of women's responses in this study makes clear the need to attend to gendered analysis of social, economic, and cultural experiences of roles and responsibilities before, during, and after conflict, and displacement to develop an understanding of the ways women's experiences are shaped differently than men's. 7. Further research. Finally, future research is recommended to better understand the factors associated with men's decreased participation in many areas of the family. Understanding the nature of the social and cultural changes in both men's and women's relationships appear crucial in stemming the economic losses, diminished household income from livelihood activities, and land vulnerability that appear to have had the most impact on the lives of these women. Thus, this article includes the research question, key findings, and implications for practice and further research that we have highlighted a section for inclusion within a conclusion section. 2. A literary approach. In this background segment, the author introduces a qualitative study by Ambrosino that employs a literary narrative approach. The study focuses on Wonnie Lee, an individual with intellectual disability, who finds life meaning from his daily birthright. Through shared rights and observations, Ambrosino gains insights into Wonnie Lee's life, shifting his perspective from seeing Wonnie Lee as an exotic subject to recognizing him as a typical individual engaging with everyday cultural elements like public transportation to fulfill his needs. And this part begins by discussion about Ambrosino's research project. Ambrosino then talked about how he used the literary theory in the long-term project and how he used rhetorical devices to profile his participants. And then Ambrosino talked about the participant, Wonnie Lee, in details. Then an interpretation is made of Wonnie Lee's story. Next, he brings in the literature. Then he returns to what he learned from Wonnie Lee in another interpretive segment. Then Ambrosino moves into a limitation and he asks a question. Finally, the author speaks to the significance of the study. This is a concept map based on the Wonnie Lee story. It can help explain how this literary approach goes backward and forward through important elements of a description, including participant, theory, literature, interpretation, limitations, and unique contributions often found in concluding sections of a qualitative study. 5. Summary. In this chapter, we've talked about how to conclude a qualitative study and write a conclusion section. The conclusion section can include a summary of the findings, implications of the study, a call for further research, the personal stance of the researcher, limitations of the study, commentary that relates to the outcomes, and the outcomes that reflect the type of research tale being told. So these elements can flow into a conclusion section, and you might examine several conclusion sections to see how authors incorporate them into scientifically oriented or a literary oriented conclusion of a qualitative journal article. So thank you very much for your listening.